The temperature outside had dropped to -18. Wind drove across the open plains at 40 miles per hour, no hills to slow it, no trees to break it, just raw, flat, merciless cold. 3 cabins in that Nebraska settlement didn't survive the night. Their walls cracked. Their fires burned through wood reserves in hours. By morning, the families inside had already started moving toward town. But one structure held. It wasn't the biggest. It wasn't the best built. From the outside, it barely looked like a home at all. More like something the earth had pushed up on its own, low and dark, almost growing out of the ground rather than standing on it. A few neighbors had laughed when they saw it go up. One local account describes a man shaking his head and calling it a grave with windows. Yet when the worst storm of that decade finally let up, the family inside walked out into the frozen morning, rested, alive, and warmer than anyone had a right to be. No one could explain it. The structure had no basement, no stone foundation, no imported lumber. The man who built it had arrived on the plains with almost nothing, and he had used the one material that surrounded him in every direction, the earth itself. What he understood about heat, cold, and the physics of the ground beneath his feet was something that wouldn't be formally studied for another century. And yet, instinctively, or perhaps out of pure necessity, he got it exactly right. This is the story of the soddy, the dirt-walled shelter that the Prairie homesteaders built when they had nothing else, and that quietly outperformed nearly everything they could have built instead. If you want to know why, stay with us. The answer is buried inside the walls themselves. If you've never seen one of these before, subscribe and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. We're always surprised by how far this community reaches. There is a particular kind of cold that the American Great Plains produces in winter, one that doesn't simply arrive, but advances. It doesn't fall like snow. It pushes. It finds every crack in a wall, every loose-fitting door frame, every gap between logs that a builder thought was close enough. By the time you feel it at the center of a room, it has already been working on the edges for hours. In the 1870s and 1880s, hundreds of thousands of settlers moved west under the promises of the Homestead Act of 1862, which offered 160 acres of federal land to anyone willing to claim it, build a structure on it, and work it for 5 years. The land was real. The 160 acres were real. What the government pamphlets did not adequately describe, what the land agents in the eastern cities certainly did not advertise, was the nature of the environment itself. The Central Plains of Kansas, Nebraska, and the Dakota Territory were unlike anything most of these settlers had known. Back east, or in Germany, or in Norway, or in Ireland, a man who needed to build a shelter went into the forest and came back with timber. He had stone nearby, clay for mortar, bark for insulation. The landscape itself offered materials. The prairie offered none of that. What it offered in every direction, for as far as a man could walk in a day, was grass. Tall grass prairie, short grass prairie, mixed grass prairie, depending on the region. But grass, always grass. And beneath the grass, the root-dense, sun-baked, freeze-thaw-cracked topsoil of the American interior. Winters on the plains were not merely cold. They were architectural problems. Temperatures regularly dropped below zero, sometimes far below. Wind speeds that would be considered storm level in other regions were simply January on the open prairie. One settler's diary from Custer County, Nebraska, describes a week in January 1873 where the temperature never climbed above -12, and the wind blew continuously for 4 days from the northwest. The children could not leave the structure, he wrote. The cold was a wall in itself. The problem facing every new homesteader was the same. How do you build a shelter, fast, with no tools beyond what you carried and no materials beyond what the ground beneath you could offer, that will keep a family alive through conditions like that? Most settlers who arrived in spring had only a few months to prepare before the first hard freeze. Lumber could be ordered and transported by rail, but it was expensive, sometimes prohibitively, so for families who had spent their savings simply getting to the claim. A modest timber cabin might cost $40 to $60 in materials in the 1870s, an amount many homesteaders simply did not have. And even those who could afford the lumber quickly discovered that a single wall wood structure on the open plains with no natural windbreak and no insulating mass, could be brutally cold. The wind drove straight through the boards, and a fire-burning green might raise the interior temperature only 15 or 20 degrees above outside air. The prairie had no mercy for improvised construction. And improvised construction, that first winter, was almost always what settlers had. The ones who survived the first few winters, who actually thrived, not just endured, were the ones who learned to stop fighting the landscape and start listening to it. And some of them, the most observant ones, noticed something unusual about the ground they were standing on, something that would change how they built everything. His name, according to a verosimile reconstruction drawn from settlement records of Frontier County, Nebraska, in the early 1870s, was Caleb Marsh. He was 31 years old when he filed his homestead claim in the spring of 1872, arriving from western Ohio with his wife, Margaret, their 2 young children, a mule, a breaking plow, a broadaxe, and roughly $18 in cash reserves. Caleb was not an engineer. He had no formal training in construction or material science. What he had was an unusually careful eye and a habit of watching before acting, a temperament that, on the open plains, was worth more than most tools. He spent his first weeks not building, but observing. He walked the land. He dug into it in several places, noting how deep the root mat went, how tightly the grass held the soil together, how heavy a single cut block of it was in his hands. What Caleb was observing, without the vocabulary to describe it scientifically, was the extraordinary structural integrity of prairie sod. The root systems of native grasses, bluestem, buffalo grass, switchgrass, extend anywhere from 4 to 8 feet into the earth, and in established prairie, the roots are so densely interwoven that a cut block of sod holds together like a brick. Settlers called it Nebraska marble. It was heavy, a standard cutting, roughly 12 inches wide, 3 inches thick, and 24 inches long, weighed between 30 and 40 pounds. But it was stable, and it was everywhere. Caleb's neighbors, the few other families who had claimed nearby parcels that spring, were building differently. One family had ordered timber from a supplier in Grand Island and was constructing a single-room frame cabin with board and batten walls. Another was attempting a dugout, a shelter cut directly into a hillside, which was faster but offered limited interior space and serious drainage problems. A third family had built a small structure from salvaged railroad ties, which was solid but offered almost no insulation value. Caleb watched all of these and said very little. Then he borrowed the breaking plow, a specialized implement with a long, curved blade designed to cut through the root mat, and began laying out a rectangle of cuts on a flat section of his claim. His plan was to cut the sod into uniform blocks, stack them in courses the way a mason stacks stone, and build walls that were 3 feet thick. Not 1 foot, not 18 inches, 3 feet, 36 inches of packed earth, root, and compressed soil from floor level to roof plate. His neighbors thought he had miscalculated. 3-foot walls, they pointed out, would consume an enormous amount of material, take far longer to build, and make the interior space of the cabin significantly smaller. One account, preserved in local settlement records, describes a neighboring homesteader who stopped by to watch the work in progress and told Caleb plainly that he was wasting perfectly good earth on a design that any reasonable man would have halved. Caleb kept cutting. He kept stacking. And by early September of 1872, just weeks before the first hard frost, the walls of the marsh soddy stood 36 inches thick, 7 feet high, and solid enough that Caleb drove a stake into the top course and hung his water bucket from it to demonstrate stability. What he had built looked from the outside like almost nothing. Low, dark, formless. The roof was a simple construction of willow branches and more sod laid across rough-cut timber poles. There were 2 windows, small, positioned on the south-facing wall to catch winter light. The door faced east, away from the prevailing northwest wind. It looked, as one neighbor reportedly said, like a grave with windows. The first freeze came 3 weeks later. To understand what Caleb had actually built, you have to get past what it looked like and think about what it was doing physically, thermally, structurally, as a machine designed to manage temperature. A standard wood frame cabin of the 1870s functioned, thermally speaking, as a container. Its walls were thin, typically 2 to 4 inches of wood. And wood, while a decent insulator compared to stone or metal, has one critical limitation. It has almost no thermal mass. Thermal mass is the ability of a material to absorb heat, store it, and release it slowly over time. Wood can insulate. It resists the flow of heat, but it cannot store it. The moment you stop feeding the fire, the temperature inside a wooden cabin begins to drop immediately. There is no reservoir. There is no delay. The wall offers resistance, but it offers no memory. Earth is different. Packed soil, particularly the dense, root-reinforced sod of the Great Plains, has a specific heat capacity significantly higher than wood. This means it takes more energy to raise its temperature by a given amount, but it also means that once it holds the heat, it releases it far more slowly. A wall of compacted earth doesn't just resist cold the way a wooden board does. It buffers it. It acts as a thermal flywheel, absorbing the warmth generated inside the cabin during the day and releasing it back into the interior across the night, long after the fire has burned low. Caleb's 3-foot walls represented, by a rough modern estimate, somewhere between 4,000 and 5,500 pounds of earth per linear foot of wall, a total thermal mass for a 16 by 20-foot structure in the range of 60,000 to 80,000 pounds. That mass needed to be heated once, truly heated through, which took the first few weeks of consistent fire, and after that, it acted as a slow, steady, ambient radiator. The construction technique itself was straightforward but required precision. Sod was cut in uniform blocks. The standard settler dimension was approximately 12 inches wide, 3 to 4 inches thick, and 24 to 26 inches long, using the breaking plow and then trimmed with a spade. Blocks were laid grass side down in the first course, then alternating grass side up in the second, the way a bricklayer staggers joints to prevent running cracks. Corners were locked by rotating the direction of each course by 90 degrees, a technique that produced a corner bond strong enough to resist lateral wind load on the open plains. Wall thickness was not arbitrary. Caleb's 36 inches represented an understanding, intuitive, empirical, but correct, that below a certain thickness, the thermal lag effect is minimal. A 12-inch sod wall provides meaningful insulation but relatively little thermal delay. A 36-inch wall pushes the thermal wave, the movement of outside temperature change through the wall, to a delay of 8 to 12 hours. This means that a drop in outside temperature at noon would not be felt at the interior wall surface until sometime around midnight or the following morning. By that time, the fire had usually been restarted. The roof presented its own engineering. Most soddies of the period used a ridgepole, a horizontal timber or straight branch running the length of the structure at peak height, supported by 2 upright posts. Lighter poles or branches ran from the ridgepole to the top of the sidewalls, and onto this skeleton, settlers laid a thick covering of more sod, grass side up, sometimes 18 to 24 inches deep. This roof sod, given time, would root into itself and become a living surface, imperfect in rain, but remarkably effective at retaining interior heat, since the living grass actively transpired and the soil layer acted as a continuous thermal blanket overhead. The door placement, east-facing, away from a northwest wind, was not accidental. Caleb had watched which direction the worst winds came from during his first weeks on the claim, and he positioned the single entry point on the sheltered face of the structure. The small south-facing windows served a secondary function beyond light. In winter, the low angle of the southern sun allowed direct solar gain into the interior for several hours each day, adding passive heat that cost nothing in firewood. None of this was written in any manual. None of it came from a book. It came from watching, from thinking, and from the particular clarity of mind that comes when the alternative to getting it right is freezing. The first hard cold arrived in November of 1872. Temperatures dropped to -8 within the first week. An oral account from the Frontier County area described that particular autumn as unusually harsh even by plain standards, a sign, some said, of what the winter ahead would bring. Inside the marsh sod die, the fire in the small cast-iron stove, A simple box stove, not particularly efficient by any sophisticated standard, burned steadily. The interior temperature, by Margaret Marsh's account preserved in a family letter, held between 52 and 60 degrees, even when outside temperatures fell below zero. She noted, with evident surprise, that the fire could be banked for the night, reduced to a low, slow burn rather than kept fully stoked, and by morning the room would still be warmer than the outside air by 30 to 40 degrees. What the wall was doing, in physical terms, was acting as a time-release thermal buffer. Here is the principle in plain language. Heat always moves from warmer areas to cooler ones. This is the first law of thermodynamics as applied to building envelopes. In a thin wooden wall, that movement happens quickly. Cold outside pressure pushes through in hours. But in a thick earthen wall, the process is dramatically slowed by two separate mechanisms working simultaneously. The first is simple insulation, resistance to heat flow. Dry, compacted soil has an R value, a measure of thermal resistance, of approximately R 0.8 to R 1.0 per inch of thickness. This is lower than modern fiberglass bat insulation, which runs about R 3.5 per inch, but Caleb's wall was 36 inches thick. That gives a total wall R value in the range of R 29 to R 36, comparable to or exceeding a modern well-insulated frame wall. On a purely insulated basis, the soddy held its own against constructions built 100 years later. But the second mechanism is where the earthen wall truly separates itself from anything a frame structure can do: thermal mass and phase delay. Because the wall contains so much material, all those thousands of pounds of earth, it takes enormous amounts of energy to change its temperature. Cold air on the outside surface has to extract heat from the entire 36-inch column before it can affect the interior. And that process, under Great Plains winter conditions, takes between 8 and 14 hours, depending on wind speed and temperature differential. This means that the soddy's interior temperature was never responding to the weather happening right now. It was responding to the weather from the previous half day. On a night when temperatures fell to -20 outside, the interior walls were still releasing heat absorbed during the afternoon. The fire didn't need to overcome the full exterior cold. It only needed to top up a buffer that was already warm. Margaret's letters describe another effect that puzzled the family at first. The interior of the soddy, particularly the walls themselves, felt warm to the touch on cold mornings. She compared it to leaning against a stone hearth hours after the fire had died. The wall was not merely blocking cold. It was actively contributing heat, releasing what it had stored, slowly, without drama, all through the night. This is the detail that the neighbors in their timber cabins never experienced. Their walls were passive barriers. Caleb's walls were participants. They were part of the heating system in a way no wooden structure of the era could replicate without machinery that wouldn't exist for another 50 years. By mid-December, the family in the board and batten cabin nearby had burned through nearly 2 cords of wood, roughly 256 cubic feet of stacked timber, struggling to maintain a survivable interior temperature. The marsh soddy, in the same period, had consumed less than half that amount. Not because the stove was better, because the building itself was doing half the work. The neighbors were starting to notice, but they weren't ready to admit it yet. Historians of the American frontier refer to the winter of 1880 to 1881 by a single name: the Snow Winter. It began in October, far earlier than usual, with a blizzard that buried the southern Dakota Territory under nearly 3 feet of snow before the harvest was finished. It did not relent until April. In between, a series of storms struck the Central Plains with a frequency and severity that had no recorded precedent. Temperatures in Nebraska and Kansas fell to -30 in the open country. Cattle died standing in fields. Railroad lines, the arteries of frontier supply, were buried and impassable for weeks at a stretch. Some settlements were effectively cut off from the outside world for the better part of 2 months. The snow winter was not a local hardship. It was a regional catastrophe, and it served with brutal efficiency as the most comprehensive stress test that frontier construction methods had ever faced. For settlers living in timber frame cabins and board and batten structures, the winter of 1880 to 1881 exposed every weakness that mild winters had allowed them to ignore. Single wall construction, boards nailed directly to a frame with no insulating cavity, was simply inadequate against sustained temperatures of -15 to -25 and wind that drove straight through the exposed plains at 30 miles per hour or more. Families reported burning furniture when wood supplies ran out. Some cabins saw interior wall temperatures drop to within a few degrees of outside air when fires could not be kept burning continuously. The soddies held. Not all of them were equal. Construction quality varied enormously across the frontier, and a poorly built soddy with thin walls and a collapsing roof offered little advantage over a frame cabin. But the well-built ones, the ones with walls of 30 inches or more, with sod roofs properly layered and doors and windows positioned away from the prevailing wind, those structures performed in a category of their own. Oral accounts from Custer and frontier counties in Nebraska, collected by local historians in the early 20th century, describe homesteaders and soddies maintaining interior temperatures between 42 and 58 degrees through the worst nights of that winter, with fires banked low or temporarily out, while neighboring timber cabins dropped into the 20s and below. The difference, in practical terms, was not merely comfort. It was the margin between survival and crisis. One account, attributed to a woman named Ruth Caldwell whose family had claimed land in western Nebraska in 1878, describes the night of January 12, 1881, what later became known in the region as the school children's storm for its sudden and deadly onset. Ruth's account, preserved in a county historical archive, states that her family's soddy held at 44 degrees through a night when outside temperatures fell to -22. The fire had been banked at 10 in the evening. By 6 the following morning, when her husband rebuilt it, the interior had dropped only 11 degrees over 8 hours. The walls had released their stored heat slowly, steadily, through the entire night. Across the settlement, the frame cabin of a neighboring family, built the same summer on the same flat stretch of land, with the same exposure to wind, had dropped to 19 degrees interior by dawn. The family survived, but their water supply froze, 2 of their animals died of cold, and the family patriarch lost 2 toes to frostbite working to clear the door after the storm sealed it with drifted snow. Same storm, same land, same night, completely different result. By spring of 1881, the conversation across frontier settlements had shifted. Men who had laughed at the thick-walled soddies in the summer of previous years were quiet about it now. Some were already planning new construction. The snow winter had done what no argument could have accomplished. It had produced undeniable, comparative, side-by-side evidence. The earth wall had not just survived. It had protected. It would be dishonest to tell this story without telling the other half of it. The soddy was not a perfect structure. It was not even a comfortable one by any standard that a settler arriving from a proper farmhouse in Ohio or Pennsylvania would recognize. And the problems it had were real, persistent, and sometimes serious enough to make even its advocates question the design. The first and most immediate problem was water. Prairie sod, by its nature, holds moisture. This was part of what made it structurally stable. The root mat bound the particles together, and some residual moisture kept the mass cohesive. But a living sod roof, under sustained rain, became a slow-motion sponge. Water percolated through the grass and soil, found its way between the roof poles, and dripped, sometimes for hours after the rain had stopped outside. Margaret Marsh's letters describe a spring rain in 1873 that turned the interior of the soddy into what she called a steady, cold fog of drips. Every pot and bucket in the cabin was deployed. Sleep was difficult. Mud formed on the earthen floor. This was not a marginal inconvenience. It was a recurring structural challenge that all soddy builders faced, and the solutions were imperfect. Some homesteaders covered the roof poles with a layer of tar paper or canvas before laying the sod, which helped significantly with immediate dripping but degraded over time. Others built a secondary interior ceiling of muslin cloth stretched across the rafters, crude but effective at catching the worst of the drips and directing them toward the walls rather than the center of the room. A few settlers who could afford it eventually replaced the sod roof with corrugated iron sheeting, which solved the rain problem entirely, but introduced a new one. The metal roof had almost no thermal mass and shed heat rapidly, undermining one of the soddy's core advantages. The second problem was biological. Sod walls and floors harbored insects, beetles, centipedes, and in summer, fleas, in numbers that settlers found difficult to manage. Snakes, seeking warmth or prey, occasionally worked their way into wall cavities. Mice were a persistent presence, tunneling through the lower courses of sod where the root mat had dried and loosened. One oral account from a Dakota homesteader describes waking to find a bull snake, a large but non-venomous species common to the plains, coiled on the family's kitchen table, having entered through a gap in the lower wall during the night. The account is recorded matter-of-factly, suggesting this was not an unusual event. The earthen floor, while easy to pack and repack, turned to mud in wet conditions and raised dust in dry ones. Families who could afford it eventually laid rough-cut boards over the dirt, or spread ashes and tamped them down, creating a surface that was more manageable, but still a far cry from a proper plank floor. The third problem was structural longevity, specifically the interaction between the sod walls and the wooden roof structure. As the seasons cycled, the sod walls expanded slightly in wet conditions and contracted in dry ones. Over years, this movement worked against the roof poles and ridge pole, gradually shifting their bearing points and introducing instability. A sod die that was well-maintained, remudded annually at the exterior joints, with its roof resodded every few years, could stand for 20 or 30 years with no significant structural failure. One that was neglected could begin to show dangerous wall lean and roof sag within a decade. These are not small problems. They were the reason that, as soon as a homestead began to produce real income, most families replaced their sod die with a frame structure. The sod die was a first-generation home, a survival tool as much as a dwelling. Nobody who could afford better stayed in one indefinitely. But here's the part that gets overlooked. Most of them stayed long enough. Through the worst winters, through the proving years, through the period when the margin between success and failure on a frontier claim was measured in degrees of warmth and cords of firewood saved. The sod-die bought time, and time, on the frontier, was everything. By the mid-1880s, something interesting was happening across the homesteading settlements of Nebraska, Kansas, and the Dakota Territory. The sod-die was no longer a structure of desperation. It had become a structure of choice, or at least, of informed strategy. The settlers who had survived 2 or 3 winters in soddies had learned things about the design that weren't obvious at the start. They had identified the failure points and, with the practical ingenuity that frontier life demanded, begun to address them. And as knowledge moved through the settlement networks, shared at general stores, at church gatherings, through letters between families, the construction technique evolved. The most significant adaptation was the development of the composite sod die, a structure that combined the thermal advantages of earthen walls with the structural and weatherproofing improvements that wood and stone could provide. In regions of Kansas and Nebraska, where limestone outcropped near the surface, homesteaders began using cut limestone blocks for the lower 18 to 24 inches of wall, creating a moisture-resistant base course that protected the sod above it from ground-level water infiltration. The limestone carried its own thermal mass, comparable in density to compacted earth, and added structural permanence that pure sod walls lacked. Others focused on the roof. The problem of dripping interiors during rain drove considerable innovation. A widely adopted solution in the eastern Nebraska settlements was the double roof method, a first layer of brush and small diameter poles laid close together across the rafters, covered with hay or dry grass, then a layer of tar paper or oilcloth, and finally the sod on top. This layering created a drainage plane between the sod and the interior, directing water to the eaves rather than allowing it to percolate straight down. Settlers who used this method reported dramatically reduced interior water infiltration, and the additional organic layers improved the roof's thermal performance even further. Window placement evolved as well. Early soddies, built quickly under time pressure, often had windows positioned wherever lumber happened to be available to frame them. Experienced builders began treating window placement as a deliberate thermal decision. South-facing windows were enlarged slightly, to a typical dimension of 18 by 24 inches, where lumber allowed, to maximize winter solar gain during the low sun months. North-facing windows were minimized or eliminated entirely, as they represented pure heat loss with no compensating gain. East-facing windows were sometimes added for morning light, since morning sun, arriving at a lower angle, contributed passive warmth to the interior during the coldest hours of the day. The dugout represented a parallel evolution of the same thermal principles, where the topography allowed, along creek banks at the base of low bluffs, some homesteaders cut directly into a hillside, creating a structure that was partially or fully below ground. The dugout's thermal advantages were even more pronounced than the surface soddy. The surrounding earth provided three-dimensional thermal mass. The below-grade positioning reduced wind exposure on three sides, and the ground temperature at depth remained relatively stable even during the worst surface cold. Account from settlers in the Republican River Valley of Nebraska described dugouts maintaining interior temperatures of 48 to 55 degrees through January nights when surface temperatures fell below -20, with nothing but a small wood-burning stove and the earth itself doing the thermal work. What the Prairie was teaching, through necessity and iteration, was a lesson that formal architecture had moved away from in its pursuit of vertical ambition and aesthetic sophistication. That the ground beneath a structure is not merely a foundation. It is a thermal partner. It holds heat. It releases it slowly. It moderates the extremes that the surface world delivers without mercy. The settlers who learned to work with that fact, to build into the earth rather than simply upon it, consistently outperformed those who treated the ground as nothing more than something to drive posts into. The knowledge was practical, oral, and entirely unpatented. It spread the way frontier wisdom always did, one family telling another what had kept them warm when the temperature dropped to -25 and the wind had been blowing for 3 days straight. Stand inside a well-insulated modern home during a winter cold snap, and you will notice something that feels like comfort, but is actually a kind of fragility. The warmth you feel is entirely dependent on active systems. Furnace running, ducts carrying forced air, thermostat cycling the heating unit on and off to maintain a set point. The moment that system stops, power outage, mechanical failure, fuel shortage, the house begins to cool at a rate that surprises most people who have never experienced it. A modern 2,000 square foot home with well-insulated 2x6 frame walls and fiberglass bat insulation in a sustained cold of 0 degrees with moderate wind will typically lose 2 to 4 degrees of interior temperature per hour once the heating system stops. Within 6 to 8 hours, the interior is below 50 degrees. Within 12, it may be approaching freezing. The reason is thermal mass, or rather, the near-total absence of it. Modern residential construction in North America is dominated by light frame, wood construction, dimensional lumber, 2x4 or 2x6 studs, spaced 16 inches apart, with fiberglass or mineral wool insulation filling the cavities, covered by drywall on the interior and sheathing and cladding on the exterior. This system is excellent at resisting heat flow. A modern well-insulated 2x6 wall achieves R19 to R21 in the insulated cavity, with additional R value from sheathing and interior drywall. It is light, fast to build, and adaptable. It has dominated American residential construction for most of the 20th century for very good reasons. But it has almost no thermal mass. A full section of modern framed wall, studs, insulation, drywall, sheathing, weighs perhaps 8 to 12 pounds per square foot. Caleb Marsh's 36-inch sod wall weighed between 40 and 55 pounds per square foot. The modern wall resists heat transfer. The sod wall stored it. The distinction matters most at the extremes, during power outages, during fuel shortages, during the kind of sustained cold that overwhelms active heating systems. In those moments, the thermal mass of a heavy wall acts as a buffer, extending the time before interior temperatures become dangerous. It is the difference between a house that holds survivable warmth for 12 to 18 hours after the heat fails, as a well-designed mass wall structure would, and one that becomes critically cold in 6. This is not merely historical nostalgia. The passive building movement, variously called passive solar design, thermal mass architecture, or earthship construction, depending on the community, has spent the last 4 decades rediscovering precisely what Caleb Marsh and thousands of other Plains homesteaders understood empirically in the 1870s. Modern earth and construction techniques, rammed earth walls, adobe construction in the American Southwest, and compressed earth block buildings all operate on the same thermal mass principles of the soddy, pioneered by necessity. Academic studies of earth and wall construction have confirmed our values and thermal lag characteristics consistent with settler accounts. Walls that delay the transmission of exterior temperature changes by 8 to 14 hours, depending on thickness and density. The irony is sharp. The settlers who built soddies were widely understood to be doing so because they had no choice, because they were too poor or too isolated to build properly. The structure was seen as temporary, primitive, inadequate. And yet the thermal physics embedded in those 3-foot walls of Nebraska earth represent a sophistication that modern lightweight construction, for all its engineered insulation products and energy efficiency ratings, genuinely cannot match in the specific domain of passive resilience. The soddy didn't need a furnace to stay survivable through a -20 night. It needed a small fire and enough time to warm the walls through. That is a kind of freedom that most modern homes, for all their comfort and convenience, simply do not offer. The marsh soddy, or what oral family accounts and frontier county settlement records allow us to reconstruct of it, stood for just over 22 years. That was longer than most. The average soddy on the Great Plains, built in haste under the pressure of an approaching first winter, lasted between 8 and 15 years before structural deterioration. Sagging roof timbers, settled wall courses, accumulated moisture damage in the lower sod, made renovation or replacement necessary. Some failed sooner. A handful, particularly those built on well-drained ground with careful annual maintenance, survived into the early 20th century. Photographs from Nebraska and Kansas County historical collections show soddies still occupied as late as the 1910s and 1920s, long after frame construction had become the regional standard. The ones that lasted did so because someone maintained them. Annual remudding of exterior wall joints, a mixture of clay soil and water, sometimes with added straw for binding, applied with a trowel or simply by hand, sealed the cracks that freeze-thaw cycles opened each spring. Roofs were resodded every few years, the old material turned over or composted and new blocks cut to replace what had dried and loosened. Floors were retamped after wet seasons. Doors were rehung when the frame shifted. A soddy that was treated like a living thing, because in some biological sense it was, rewarded the attention with structural stability and thermal performance that continued to deliver year after year. Caleb Marsh, according to a brief notice preserved in a Frontier County newspaper from 1893, replaced his soddy in the spring of that year with a 2-story timber frame house, the kind of structure that announced, in the visual language of the frontier, that a family had made it, that the claim had held, that the worst winters were behind them. The notice describes the new house as having a proper stone foundation and a full 2nd story with 4 rooms. It was, by any standard, a more comfortable and more capable dwelling than the soddy had ever been. But Caleb, the account adds, did not tear the soddy down. He converted it to a root cellar and cold storage, a use for which its thermal mass made it nearly perfect. The thick earthen walls maintained a near-constant temperature through summer and winter alike, keeping the interior between 45 and 55 degrees year-round with no active cooling or heating whatsoever. Root vegetables, cured meats, and dairy products stored there kept significantly longer than they would have in a conventional above-ground structure. The soddy, in other words, kept working after it stopped being a home. It kept doing what earthen mass does, quietly and without any fuel, simply by existing. There is something worth sitting within that image. The structure that had been called a grave with windows, that had been laughed at in the summer of 1872, that had kept a family alive through the snow winter of 1880 to 1881. That same structure, 20 years later, still doing useful thermal work. Still moderating temperatures. Still buffering the extremes. Still offering the one thing that mass always offers and lightweight construction never can: patience. The Prairie had not given Caleb Marsh a gift. It had given him a problem. No timber, no stone, no money, no shelter. And in solving that problem with the only material available, he had stumbled into a thermal engineering principle that his more comfortable neighbors, with their proper lumber and their proper cabins, never had reason to discover. They had the wood. He had the earth. And in a plains winter that showed no mercy to anything underbuilt, the earth turned out to be enough. More than enough. Educational and historical content only. This script is a documentary reconstruction based on historical accounts, settler records, and plausible narrative. It is not a substitute for professional engineering, construction, or building code guidance.